Good afternoon, everyone. Hope that you are having a good week so far, and pray that you and your family are staying safe, staying healthy. We want to extend at this time the request that if there's anything that you need delivered to your house, if you need groceries picked up, if you need meals prepared, things of that nature, please reach out and let us know about that. We're doing our best to stay connected to our church family and take care of needs as they come up, but it would be of great help to us if there's someone that you know of that needs assistance or needs help, or if you yourself need something done or something taken care of, please reach out to us and give us the opportunity to do that as part of our church family. As we begin today, 3rd through 6th graders, what was the name of the 12th month according to Esther 3? What was the name of the 12th month according to Esther 3? How much money did Haman offer to carry out his plan? If you remember, that was his sort of sales pitch to the king, was offering to give a certain sum of money to the king's treasuries. Number 3, what day of the 12th month was Haman's plan to be carried out? And then finally, how did everyone feel after the revelation of this plan and this plot? How did everyone feel except Haman and the king? All right, so those are our questions for our 3rd through 6th graders. As we get into our devotional today, we are into Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 4. And just as a reminder, you know sort of the scene at this point. You know that Haman has revealed ultimately what his goal has been from pretty much the word go. His intention was to destroy the Jews, and certainly after he found out that Mordecai, this man that he felt was being disrespectful to him, once he found out that Mordecai was a Jew, that just put his plan in motion. And over the course of several months, about 11 months, he puts this plan into motion, and then he reveals his plan, and then basically says 1 year from that day, when he revealed his plan, that is when it's going to go into effect. And so Mordecai hears this, and verse 1 of chapter 4 tells you, following, just by way of clarification here, at the end of chapter 3, we talked about, and at length, that the majority of the people who heard this were shocked. I would say even some of those who were probably Persians or part of the Medes empire, I would imagine they were confused as well. The Jews had become sort of just a part of their community. They had just been a part of what was going on in all these different provinces. And so for them, for everyone, other than Haman and Ahasuerus, there is mass confusion. Mordecai has the response that you would expect from someone who prides himself on taking care of others and who prides himself on empathy, sympathy, and compassion. He can't handle the news, and he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes, the Bible tells us here in Esther 4. And he went out in the midst of the city. Now that is a little bit of a difference between the way Mordecai was prior to this plot and now after the plot. Mordecai's been sort of okay with being behind the scenes. He's been okay with being not necessarily an afterthought, but he's been okay with being somebody who is not at the forefront, who doesn't get attention. A lot of the things that he's been doing, sort of working alongside of Esther, he's been okay not being the one to be recognized for that. He's been allowing Esther to sort of do what she needs to do as the queen, and he has not been demanding of any sort of recognition. Now we know that Esther, being trained and raised by Mordecai, is not willing to take the credit herself, and so she even goes out of her way to give Mordecai credit where credit is earned and deserved. But again, this is different. Mordecai is heartbroken. He is crushed, and as far as his personality goes, that sort of goes out the window. And he now becomes sort of the focal point, the view, if you will, of everyone in Susa. He is there before them in the midst of the city, and he is in sackcloth and ashes, and he is screaming, he is crying, He is at the king's gate doing these things. He knows he can't go in. Verse 2 tells us that. Verse 3, there's a lot of this same great mourning and along with fasting and weeping and lamenting. I mean, all of this is going on. This is a devastating announcement. And Mordecai can no longer pretend, I guess, maybe that's the wrong word, but Mordecai can no longer stand outside. He can no longer stand behind the scenes. And now he makes this known that not only is he proud to be a Jew, he certainly is proud to be a Jew, but at this point he's willing to take on that leadership role. Now, that parlays itself, I guess, into the next part of this particular chapter. The young women who had been so used to, and the eunuchs who had been so used to coming out into the courtyard there, coming up to the king's gate, and seeing Mordecai and talking to Mordecai and just having an everyday conversation with him, they're shocked. They see what's happened and they know what's going on. And when they tell Esther, she has the response that you expect. You can imagine, some of you have been through this. Unfortunately, I hate it for you, and I certainly wish it were not so, but many of us have experienced times where we've seen family members, fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, maybe even siblings who have lost someone very close to them, or who have gone through a very, very trying time, a very horrific thing might have happened, or whatever the case might be. You've seen someone that you deeply care about go through something horrible. And unfortunately, we've probably all been there at some point in our life. It changes who you are, even though you're not, maybe not directly going through it. It changes who you are. Esther's the queen. In her mind at this point, okay, let's make that very clear. In her mind at this point, she is in a perfect position really to come out of this untouched. But she cannot help but look at Mordecai, knowing what Mordecai's done for her, and be moved, and be discouraged and distressed, is what the English Standard Version uses here in verse 4. She tries to send clothes to Mordecai so that he can take off the sackcloth, and he's not going to do that, because, again, he is now willing to take on this leadership role. Esther calls for one of her other eunuchs, and she sends him out to go to Mordecai, learn what's going on, give me the full details of everything that you know. In verse 7 here in Esther chapter 4, Mordecai does tell him everything that he knows, and even the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. So, not only does it get word of mouth back to Esther, Mordecai, verse 8 says, even has a copy of the written decree. So he sends all of this information back to Esther and says, look, you're going to have to go to the king and you're going to have to say something. Now it's now time for you to take a stand for who you are, your ancestry, all of those things. Mordecai's done that by putting on the sackcloth and ashes and going out into the town square and yelling and hollering and crying out for the things that are going on. Mordecai's done that. Now he looks at Esther and he says, now it's your turn. So Esther spoke to this eunuch and says, go back out to Mordecai and you say, verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. As for me, I've not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So here's what Esther says. This is not an excuse as much as it is sort of evidence as to why she does not feel comfortable yet. She says, listen, I've been here these last 30 days. I've been standing around. I've been here as the queen, and he has not called me in to the inner court. She says, look, everybody knows. If you go into that inner court and you're not called, there is but one law, and you will be put to death. So you can sort of, hopefully you can imagine, you can think through, you can understand, this is not an easy situation for Esther. We look at this and we say, well, of course, Esther is the queen. She just can go wherever she wants, say whatever she wants, and move on with life. There's a reason why this book begins where it begins. When Queen Vashti decided, because she was the queen, she no longer had to do exactly what the king said. She was deposed. She was thrown out of the kingdom. And for other than maybe just a couple of different instances, she's not even thought about, mentioned, or discussed again. In this case, Esther looks at the situation and says, not only could he depose me, the truth is, if I go barging into the inner court, he'll have me killed. When you think about that, put yourself in her situation. It's not an excuse. This isn't Exodus 3 and 4 where Moses stood before a burning bush and tried to get God to let him off the hook. This is a woman who looks at her position and says, Mordecai, you don't understand. I can't do anything. I can't do anything. Now, many of you know I've used this often, and you know how I feel about the word can't. You know that in our house we push our children very hard to refuse that word. To not say, I can't do something. We've mentioned it many times that, if you feel like there's something that you're not able to achieve, then let's see if we can find a different way to accomplish it, rather than trying to give up and say, I can't. Now, in Esther's situation, I understand where she's coming from 100%. And you and I know the rest of the story. You can read the rest of the story. But at this point, I completely understand where she's coming from. And I almost tend to agree with using the word can't. Except what happens next. They go to Mordecai and they tell Mordecai what Esther had said. Now, I want you to pay attention to what we've highlighted here, verses 12, 13, and 14. 13 and 14 specifically. Do not think to yourself, this is what Mordecai says, that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This is such a beautiful, beautiful thought. And what happens here is Mordecai takes what Esther had said, and he doesn't necessarily use it against her, but he causes her to think about it in a different way. Rather than saying that you can't based on the rules of the king, look at it from a different perspective. Don't use I can't as an excuse to get out of it. Look at it this way. If it's the case that you go into the inner court and he does not allow you and he has you killed, that is no different than what's going to happen to you once he finds out you're a Jew. He's going to do the exact same thing. Haman's going to have you killed too. So here's what Mordecai does. Mordecai says, look at it this way. This is the thing you were made for. This is the moment. This is where God put you, and this is why God put you there. Now, he asks it in the form of a question. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? We know the answer to that. The answer to that is absolutely. That's exactly why she came to the kingdom. Was to save her people. But in this moment, it's just a beautiful thought to think that Mordecai looks at this situation and says two things that really stand out. Number one, he uses her evidence and says, wait a minute, if that's the case, then why don't you look at it from this side, in the sense that if you think that's the way he's going to treat you even now, what do you think is going to happen when we get to this time, that time of the 12th month, and they start killing off all the Jews? They're going to do the same thing to you. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly than that, is what the faith that Mordecai has in verse 14 to say, if you keep silent, if you don't do this, if you don't stand up and take a stand somehow, then I have absolute faith that relief and deliverance will come for the Jews from another place. But the sad part is, Esther, you and your father's house and all of the people that would have remembered you and would have known you, they'll all be gone. So Esther, what is it that's holding you back? If you're scared, I understand that. I understand fear. But his question is a loaded question. It is, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The only person that knows that is God himself. And that's the reminder that Mordecai sort of lays down in front of Esther, is remember whose you are. We've said that, we've used that before with our children. A lot of you probably use that maybe with your teenager or young adult children, you might say, when they're going out on their own, or they're moving out or taking a new job. Remember who you are and remember whose you are. My parents used to say that to me sometimes, because the concept is, remember who you are, in the sense of, hey, you represent this family, and the things that you say and things that you do are going to come back to this family. But more importantly than that, remember whose you are. You belong to God. You were made in His image. His Son died on the cross for my sins so that I can have life and life more abundantly. So it's very important that I remember not only my family, but more importantly, my God. And that ultimately is the message that Mordecai delivers to Esther in this moment. Is, yeah, remember about your father's house and you and the ancestors and all those people. Remember that. But more importantly, remember whose you are. You are a child of God. And God has put you in this position for such a time as this. So, the end of the chapter goes like this. Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. Listen to this response. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa. Hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. Watch this. And if I perish, I perish. The faith that Mordecai showed her in his statement of relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, she now shows and says, gather all the Jews together. You go through this fasting for 3 days. And we'll do the same here in the queen's chambers. And at the end of those 3 days, I'm going to go to the king, even though it's against the law, even though it's not encouraged. You know what? If he kills me, then he kills me. Mordecai went away and he did everything as Esther had ordered him. Here's what I love to see, and I love this at the end of chapter 4, is you see that momentary glimpse of light in the midst of all the dark. You see, finally, you can see just ever so slightly a crack in the darkness, and the light begins to peek through. What should have been a crushing announcement, a declaration of death, has now been turned, because now Esther and Mordecai represent the light of God in the midst of that dark and horrible scheme of Haman. We'll pick up with chapter 5 at our next study, which will be Sunday night, Lord willing. Hope that you will tune in and join us then for the continuation of that study. Obviously, the practical point for today is very simple, and that is that no matter what you're going through, no matter the things that you might be dealing with personally or even as a family, you and I should always be of the opinion, should always be of the thought, that who's to say or who knows if we weren't put in that position for such a time as this. In other words, you're dealing with the situation that we're dealing with in our country. You're dealing with a shutdown right now. Well, maybe there's a reason. We have no proof that God put this on our country, and I wish people would stop saying that personally. But we can certainly take advantage of this, and who's to say that even this momentary break in our usual, this new normal that we're all now experiencing, who's to say that out of that does not come some incredible, uplifting reignition of fire when it comes to people's spiritual lives? You can see the light even in the midst of the dark. That's the practical point for today. Again, I hope that you'll pick up with our study with us Sunday night. Certainly want you to tune in. We are going to attempt to have the worship hour up around our normal time. Certainly hope that just because it's not up at a specific time does not sway you or draw you away from not tuning in or taking part in our worship. But we are certainly going to try an effort to do that. We'll have Bible class up at around the 9 o'clock hour on Sunday morning, and then worship up around the 10 o'clock hour. And certainly want you to tune in and take part of that and remain connected to our church family, even though we're having to do it in some rather odd ways. We're doing our best to stay connected as a church family, and pray that you want to be a part of that and stay connected as well. Hope you have a wonderful evening, a wonderful weekend. We look forward to worshiping together Sunday morning.